All right, welcome back. Now, my guess is this last hour and 15 minutes has been a little bit of a stretch for some of you. It's maybe a little dry. I can be worse, but I'll try not to be. It is a challenge to think about these kinds of things because they're not typical the sorts of things you think too much about. I wanted to mention something that Katie drew my attention to, and you may be interested in this. There's I don't know, Katie, you want to talk about this at all? Why don't you do that? Because you actually have seen it and I haven't, so.
Yeah. Have you guys heard of TED Radio Talk Hour? A couple of you, yeah. I listened to this a couple of months ago, and as we were just learning this morning about different worldviews, I thought this, if you guys are interested in a little bit more time thinking about it, this would be a good hour spent. It's called, if you search TED Radio Hour and then just type in believers and doubters, they kind of go through, the first part they actually invite Billy Graham to come and share on his life, which is awesome because it's a very secular podcast normally. And then it goes into like a classical approach to atheism and then a more modern approach to atheism. And that's when they're trying to bridge the gap of like atheism, but then also like pairing in beauty and love and truth and value and stuff. So if you're interested in more like learning about modern day atheism, classical atheism, that would be a good one.
Okay. Thank you, Katie. It sounds like it would be a really fascinating program. All right. Are we ready to take off again?
Yes.
Take us somewhere. Okay. The two viewpoints that we talked about a moment ago, or the last hour, the last things about monism and dualism, I mentioned both of them stand in contradistinction from biblical creationism. Biblical creationism can be called contingent dualism. That is, that there are in fact two stuffs in the world, but only one of them is eternal, and the other one is contingent upon the one who is eternal. So you have God who is eternal, but you have a world that he has created. So it's not like classical Greek dualism where evil and good are eternally opposite, matter and spirit are eternally opposite, but rather it is God first who creates the world, not out of himself, but out of nothing, and then this creation owes its existence to God itself. So he creates the world out of nothing. He is free to create or not to create. Have you ever thought about why God decided to create the world? What, you know, I mean, I don't think we can psychoanalyze God, but it is an interesting idea. Why did he do this? He didn't have to do this. This wasn't something he needed. He was free to create or not to create. And then that also means that God, if evil exists, God allows it to exist temporarily, but for a greater purpose that is known to him. May not be immediately apparent to us, but it is certainly known to him. Now, we're going to get into that tomorrow when we talk about the problem of evil, so I won't go very far with that third point there. But that is unlike the other two views. In monism, evil is necessary. In classical dualism, evil is eternal. In Christian and biblical contingent dualism, evil is temporary. It is not part of God's nature, and after it comes into existence, it will only be in existence for a period of time, and then it will be done away with. Evil is temporary. So we'll talk about that a little more tomorrow. In any case, if you start only with particulars, the observable details, this imposes limitations in the way that you view the world. And it's going to be very hard for you to rise to some of those greater kinds of things. So how does the theory of unguided evolution work together with the idea that there are only particulars? This is pretty much the way it is in most secular viewpoints today. The reason I use this term unguided evolution this is the classical view of evolution, in which evolution is a series of accidents, just space, matter, time, and chance. There's no mind that guides it. Now, there are Christian thinkers who believe that God exists and that God actually guided what you might call the process of evolution. So that's different than what I'm talking about here. But the theory of unguided evolution, how does that work together with the idea that there are only particulars and no universals in the world? Any thoughts about that? Man, I'm asking you to answer all these questions and there aren't any answers to them. They're hard. Yeah.
There is like a discoverable formula
Yes.
for how that process works because
Yes.
everything's only constituted of material things. It's only governed by like chemistry and physics.
Yes. Everything is governed by chemistry and physics. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And everything is testable. Everything is demonstrable.
And eventually we'll figure it out.
Yeah, and eventually we'll figure it out. If we haven't yet, we will at some point. Yeah. I think so. I think that's the essence of it. Yeah. What about the postmodern view that there are no universals? There's truth for you, truth for me, but there's no big truth with a capital T. How much has this postmodern idea, which is really only about 30 years old, how much has this influenced the world in which we live? And how much has it influenced even the Christian world? What do you think?
I think that's like our biggest problem.
Yeah.
Or
You-
like when
yeah.
we approach a Western context with the idea of living missionally, I think that's the biggest question we face.
Might be the biggest challenge, the biggest hurdle to get over. Yeah, I think that's probably true, because this is so widely adopted within the general culture, and it is fundamentally incompatible with Christian concepts. Yes.
Can you give us some examples of what that would look like implicationally, with the postmodern view that we would
Sure.
struggle with, maybe like in line with our Christian worldview?
Sure. One would absolutely have to do with the way you think about the Bible, because in postmodernism, there is no such thing as discovering the intent of an author. All meaning is derived subjectively by the reader. This applies not only to the Bible, it applies to the Constitution of the United States, it applies to any other kind of historical document. So what is really important is not what they thought, because you can't recover that. History is irrecoverable. What is important is what I think. And so everything is immediate. So when I read the Bible, I don't really have to think about, okay, who was Paul and what was his world like and why does he use the language he uses? Rather, it's what do I think when I read this? And I am the primary definer of meaning. Meaning is not in the past. It's irrecoverable from the past. It's only immediate for me, and it's subjective to me. What I think about it may not be what you think about it, but that's fine. You can think what you think, I think what I think, and we're both true, even though we're contradicting each other. Now, you would think that just on the basis of logic alone, you'd find a flaw in that. But nonetheless, that is basically the postmodern view, and that is that subjectivism is the only real level of truth that there is, and it's different for everybody. It affects the way you would think about the Bible, absolutely. If you were going to actually be a postmodernist and study the Bible, the DBS and the SBS is a really bad place to go, because they're going to talk about context. Postmodernism says there is no context other than now. Now is the only context there is. So that's a really important implication for that. Yeah. So I suppose if you're going to really be a postmodernist, you could say Judas went out and hanged himself, so go and do thou likewise, and we'd all do that. I don't know.
Did you say the only truth is subjective truth?
Yes, subjective truth. The truth that I see myself, but it's a small truth, truth with a small t. And it doesn't have to be consistent with other people's truths. Because this really goes to the idea that I cannot know anything outside myself. There's nothing that is knowable outside myself. Yes?
Can I read you theosophy?
Is it a form of theosophy?
It reminds me of.
Oh, it reminds you of theosophy. Well, in many ways, yeah. There's some common threads there. Yeah.
They just grab truth from
Yeah.
whatever religion sounds good to them.
It's eclectic, and postmodernism is eclectic as well. Yeah, very much eclectic. Uh-huh. What Christianity says and what believers in the God of the Bible say is that there is a God who speaks from above. He doesn't speak within the culture out, but he speaks above the culture and speaks to us from that. And he does this in three ways. In his creative word, which we talked about yesterday, the creation of the world, the heavens declare the glory of God. Paul says, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen from what has been made. Paul seems to suggest that in every human being there is a capacity to apprehend God. Even if you don't know God and you don't think about God, it's still there, embedded within you. We were talking at break, three of us, and one of the guys used, which I think is a really good expression, that this thing is hardwired within us. So for all of you that are in the digital generation, that will make sense to you. We are hardwired with this kind of idea, that this concept, this ability to conceive of God. And Paul says that's true of every human being. And the problem with the human race, according to Paul, is not ignorance, but rebellion. Problem with the human race is that even though we have very little knowledge, what knowledge we have rebelled against just the same. So our basic problem is rebellion. Then the second way that God speaks from above is in his inspired word, which of course we believe is the Scripture. The Scripture is God-breathed. It comes from God as they are carried along by the Holy Spirit. And then finally in his living word, which is Christ himself. Christ is the Word, and he became flesh and lived for a while among us. And in these ways, God speaks to us from above. That's a universal. As soon as you talk about something from above, you're talking about a universal. That is not truth for you and truth for me. That's truth with a big T, and that truth is Christ. What God reveals to us about himself in the Bible is that he is personal. He relates to his creatures. He is invisible. He transcends the material world. He is above nature. He is not just a nature God, but he is above nature in that he created all of nature. He is above humans, for he created humans. He's not pagan. He's not a multiple series of deities, of gods and goddesses in a pantheon. He is unique in himself, and he is one. He does not have a consort. This is substantially different than you find in all of the other views, both secular and religious in the world. And of course, he is also multidimensional. He is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, over the last roughly 1,000 years or more, there have been a number of classical arguments for the existence of God. I don't know that these prove the existence of God beyond reasonable doubt, because if it could be proved beyond reasonable doubt, nobody would doubt it. But on the other hand, these are reasonable arguments for God's existence, and I should at least spend some time to mention them to you. One is the argument of cause. How came the universe into existence if not by God? For one thing, the universe is a very delicately balanced system. We don't just fly off and crash into Jupiter. We are bound together with all kinds of systematic systems that make the universe work and make the world work. We have the right temperature to live in this place. And how did all of this happen if there was not a cause to make it happen? Almost everything that we know about in the world is what is called secondary cause. So if I raise my hand like this with a hammer and I hit a nail the nail goes into the wood, but that's a secondary cause because the cause behind that is my arm and my hammer, okay? And behind the arm and the hammer, there is a brain that tells me I want to drive this nail into the wood. That's a secondary cause. And everything that you can see is essentially secondary cause. So if you keep tracing back secondary causes, eventually you will get to what is called a first cause. It is an uncaused cause. Okay, you with me? That then is God. The uncaused cause, or to use the philosophical term, the unmoved mover. He is not himself moved by anything else, but he does act in the universe. This is one of the old arguments for the existence of God. Another one is the argument of design. Does not the intricacy and balance of the universe suggest a mind behind it? If you, for instance, were walking through a field and you discovered a watch and you examined it, you see that it works, it keeps the hours of the day, it's on time, very intricate, the insides have all these balance mechanisms. Would it occur to you that maybe this watch came into existence by accident? That maybe some weird combination of molecules came together and suddenly you had hands and you had a minute hand and you had a spring or you had a battery or whatever's running this watch and it just kind of happened. I don't think anybody normally would think about that. If you see something with that much intricacy and that much balance, what does that suggest? Somebody made it. And in this argument, if you see a universe that is that delicately balanced, why would you not also then think that there is a mind behind the universe? Why would you think this all happened by accident and just kind of managed to be delicately balanced? So that's another argument. Another one is the argument from being. Where did we even get this idea about an infinite perfect being if not from God himself? How would we have even thought of this idea of God if there wasn't a God? Can you think about things that have never existed? Well, mostly when we try to think about that, we think of things, yeah, I can think of something that never existed, but then when you think about it, well, it's kind of like some things I know that did exist. So we're sort of actually using models to think about things. But the idea of being, where did humans get this idea? So far as we know, cows don't have this idea. Cows are eating the grass in the field and they're chewing their cud and they're thinking, I wonder if there's an infinite being out there. I wonder if there's a God. No, it's humans that think that. Where did they get this idea? And it is as old as the human race. One of the interesting things about archaeology and paleontology is that as far back as we can trace it, humans have always believed in God. The very earliest civilizations that we can track archaeologically show elements of the sacred and worship. This is endemic to the human race. And where did we get this idea if it wasn't a true idea? A fourth one is the idea of morality. Where do we get this idea that there are such things as right and wrong? Don't human moral concepts suggest that there is a moral being that's higher than us that creates this idea of right and wrong? Another one is congruity. Doesn't the belief in God make sense of all the data in the universe? Now, in the end, all of these kind of arguments for the existence of God probably are not proving the existence of God, but they certainly make the existence of God a credible way of thinking about the universe. There are some more recent arguments for the existence of God, and these are really quite modern. One is called fine-tuning. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of fine-tuning before. But fine-tuning has to do with the fact that the universe has a number of basic physical constants that must be in a really narrow range if intelligent life of our kind is to develop. These things include such things as the velocity of light, which is how fast? What's the speed of light? 186,000 miles a second. Yep. And a light year is how far it will go at that speed in a year's time. About 3 years ago, I spent an evening up on the top of the mountain here with the astronomers from the France-Canada telescope. And we were deep in space, about 30,000 light years. That's way out there. Fascinating stuff. But these are constants. They don't vary. They have to be delicately balanced in order for it to work. Now, I understand that with the theory of relativity, there are some other factors to be considered, but still they are balanced even within that. There are strong and weak nuclear forces. There's the rate of the expanding universe. There's the carbon production in stars. All of these things very delicately balanced in the physical universe to make it possible for us to live here. And so these factors are necessary for our existence. And further, they all must exist simultaneously. And it makes it highly improbable that they occurred by chance. How could all of these systems that are so delicately balanced occur by chance? It makes more sense that they're there because of a designer. And then there's one other kind of thing I'm going to mention briefly, and this is called design discourse. This has to do with biology. There's a number of structures at the molecular level that seem to be irreducibly complex. I don't know if that sentence made any sense to you, but what I'm saying by that is that there are certain mechanisms in biological life that it's hard to realize any way that they could have arrived at their present state by stages. Take, for instance, your eye. You have two of them. And what is your eye composed of? What does it have in there? Has a what? I'm sorry. A retina. Okay, there you go. Has a retina. It has a lens. It has a cornea. Has an iris. It has rods and cones. And all of these things, and sometimes it has a stick, you know. Will I mess this up if I take about a 40-second detour? Okay. It's something I ran into in a Greek manuscript last month, a couple months ago. A 6th century Greek manuscript of the Bible. The scribe made a scribal error. He was copying the Gospel of Matthew in Greek, as all ancient copies were done. And he came to this word, karphos, which is the word for speck or splinter. And it's in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, don't try to take the speck out of your brother's eye while you've got a log in your own. Okay? But he misread it. And instead of writing karphos, he wrote, karpos. One letter different. A phi versus a p. And what he ended up leaving in the Gospel of Matthew was a word that says fruit. Don't try to take the fruit out of your brother's eye until you take the log out of your own. So if you have a banana in your eye, you've got scriptural authority that you can actually work with that. Okay. Now, sorry, we took a detour. Now, I'll see if I can get back to where I was. Take your eye. Has all these elements, the iris, the lens, the rods, cones, the retina, all of these kinds of things. And all of these things need to be present at the same time in order to work. If you lose one of those elements, your eye won't work anymore. This is why it is called irreducibly complex. It has a number of complex systems within it that all must be working together at the same time in order to work at all. Now, if you follow the general path of evolutionary theory, it's that everything evolves gradually, a piece at a time, to ensure the survival or the adaptability of the organism. But how would an organism have an evolutionary result of, say, an iris all by itself without the rest of the eye? There's no reason why that would make an organism more viable to have an iris if there wasn't the rest of the eye. And so design discourse basically says there are these irreducible complexities in biological life that could not conceivably have come about by evolution, because there are too many systems that all have to come together at the same time. And the systems are all different from each other, but they are all necessary to work together to make this possible. This irreducibly complex system then is composed of these well-matched, matching parts, interacting parts, and so on. This is essentially the arguments that are coming from people like Michael Behe. I don't know if you've heard of Michael Behe. Michael Behe is a microbiologist. He wrote a really important work called Darwin's Black Box. And it's based on the idea that Darwin himself said that if someone could find an irreducibly complex system, his whole theory would go down the chute. Michael Behe says we've got all kinds of these irreducibly complex systems, and he uses the eye as one of those, and it doesn't make sense that this could have happened by a series of accidents, even with the best of evolutionary theory. So, I think I'm going to skip this discussion, and let's see here. What have I got time-wise? I got to see how I'm doing here time-wise. Okay. I want to talk now about the relationship between faith and reason. Jesus said the greatest commandment was to love the Lord your God with what? All your heart, soul, mind, your strength. Sometimes people sort of subdivide that. Well, I love God with my heart. I don't actually worry too much about my mind. And then there's other people that I want to worry about things with my mind and not worry about the other stuff. I think all of them are actually important. But the mind is an important part of that. And there is a relationship between faith and reason. For one thing, within the way that we think of it as Christians, we have an internal testimony as a test of faith, and this is the work of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit gives us assurance that the message of Jesus is true, and it convinces us that God is even greater than our doubts, and this comes from the Holy Spirit. But if we only had this, and we had no objective evidence for the Christian gospel, would we have a very strong position? In fact, the early church regarded both of these as extremely important and begins actually with this one before you get to this one, because this one begins with something like the empty tomb. That's a fact. The tomb was empty. So why was it empty? The women come on Sunday morning, it's empty. The stone has been rolled away. They had no idea how they were going to even move the stone. When we got there, the stone was rolled. Who moved it? Certainly wasn't Pilate. The Sanhedrin had no reason to move it. So you start with external coherence, and it's related to internal testimony. And so external coherence would be verification ideas that show that the Christian faith is consistent with the world of experience as we know it. And it offers the opportunity to validate your faith in the context of all of the other competing truth claims in the world. So I think in a good worldview, your test of faith should be a balance between what is internal and what is external. Both of those are important for your Christian faith. And if you have only one and not the other, you're going to hobble along intellectually and spiritually. So, Traditionally, criteria then for validation in Western thought was both objective and subjective. And that goes to the idea of logic. Did anybody ever take a course in logic? You take a college course in logic? Okay, yeah. So you're familiar with the term A is not non-A. What does that mean? That means you're not a Hindu. Because if you're a Hindu, A is non-A, because all possibilities coexist. But logically, at least, we would say A is not non-A. So there is a distinction between things that's going to hold, all right? And so we go through the process of what we call hypothesis and verification, which is loosely called the scientific method. We test things, in other words. We try to see if something can be invalidated, proved to be not true. And whatever remains that is not invalidated is a good chance of being true, unless someone later invalidates it. We categorize things by relations. Have you ever wondered why we recognize dogs as dogs? You know, I could put up here a British Mastiff, which has a head about the size of a pumpkin and weighs about 135 pounds, and a Chihuahua right next to it, which is only about this big and a little yipper, and yet instinctively we know both of those are dogs. We don't think one's a cow and the other's a dog. We know they're both dogs. Why is that? Well, probably partly just from experience and training, but we have learned to categorize certain things because of similarities in their makeup. This is part of the way we gain knowledge. And so categorization, relationships, groupings are part of the way we think about things. And we also reason in what is called syllogism. That is that if A equals B and if B equals C, then A equals C. That's an issue of logic. Okay? So we have, traditionally at least, these objective kind of criteria for truth, but we also have subjective ones. We have instinct and intuition. This is immediate perception. And so this is part of the working tools of people. We have social custom, tradition. We have authority, such as the church or the state or some other group. And as Christians, we also believe in revelation, that God discloses himself in event and word. Can you see how one side of this is objective and the other side of this is subjective? Does that make sense? Objective means it's external to yourself. Subjective means it is within yourself. Okay? To a large degree, there was a revolution, an intellectual revolution in Europe that began to change this, in which all of these categories on this side came to be X'd out in favor of these categories. And that is going to last for several hundred years. That revolution was called the Enlightenment. In more modern times, actually pretty much within your lifetime, there has been a reaction to Enlightenment philosophy, which is entirely objective, and they move backward toward much more subjectivism, which is called postmodernism. And so you see that the intellectual life of people have been sort of waffling back and forth between these two kinds of areas. So I want to start with the Enlightenment and talk just a little bit about why they rejected some of the subjective categories. First of all, they want to deny the superstition that was widely held within Europe and America as well. One of there's all kinds of ways of looking at that, I suppose, but one has to do with the idea of witches. If you go to Edinburgh, Scotland, there's the castle at Edinburgh, and then there's this big cliff that goes down to the river. About 350, more or less, women were executed from that escarpment by being pushed over the edge because they were accused of being witches. There was a lot of medieval superstition about that sort of thing, and the same was true in America. You have what's called the Salem witch trials, if you've heard about that. The Enlightenment was basically a way of saying those superstitions we're not accepting those anymore. Those are just flights of imagination, and so we're going to get rid of that. Another one was the rejection of religious violence. There was a lot of religious war back in that period of time. The 30 Years' War, for instance, between Catholics and Protestants, went on and on and on. And so they rejected that. They rejected the renunciation of external authorities, like the divine right of kings. The Americans, of course, are famous by rejecting Mr. George III. King George is not going to tell us what to do. He's never even been here. What does he know about it? So they decided to do another thing, and that's the way the American colonies got started. Skepticism about metaphysics, a lot of doubt about things that were beyond the physical world, but a lot of optimism about physical science, which was making a lot of progress in the ancient world. So in the end, the Enlightenment led the world to reason alone becoming the pathway toward truth. Today, this still is a major default system for science. Most scientists still work with Enlightenment principles. It's when you get into the soft sciences like psychology and philosophy that you begin working over into postmodernism, which is not so much Enlightenment thought. But at least Enlightenment thought has come to dominate in the Western world. And it eventually created what I would call a false wall, that somehow between faith and reason, there is this wall and you can't get from one to the other. Faith was perceived as anti-rational, and all of the things like God and love and meaning and art and so on go into that category, but it's all basically irrational. And on the other side is physics, pessimism, sociology, psychology, science as reason. Now, as we've seen in postmodernism, there is a crossover between this because postmodernism has realized that if you entirely think about reality only from this standpoint, you lose some really valuable things. In fact, I think that's what Heidi was talking about this program is going to talk about, is how some modern, even atheistic thinkers are trying to recapture these kinds of ideas that were lost in the Enlightenment. Whether they will be successful in recapturing that or not, I don't know, but they're certainly making an effort in postmodernism to do that. So now, let me ask you to get engaged here. Everybody take a deep breath. Hold it for 39 minutes. No, I'm sorry, not that long. Okay? All right. Now, let's see what you can do with this question. What might be the relationship between faith and reason with respect to the gospel? Is it even important that you have a relationship there when you talk about the gospel? Okay? I would agree, yes. So what is this relationship? How does it work? Yeah.
James says faith without works is dead.
Yeah, so what do you mean?
Basically what I'm saying is that if you're not founded or grounded on both of those things, if you don't understand how your faith works and you haven't thought through it, then
Okay.
you don't really understand what you believe
Okay.
as a Christian, and you don't actually then know how to live out of that.
Okay.
What that looks like in every day.
Okay. Yep.
The physical world can prove the invisible things because they can express.
Okay.
They can be considered an expression of something that's invisible. And I think that's why God created a physical
Okay.
arena to express invisible truth.
Okay. Have you ever thought about the fact that the Bible is a historical document? And that the events in the Bible are correlated with the events in space-time history. So when Jesus was born, who was in power? Luke tells us. Caesar Augustus, Herod the Great, Quirinius, and he also lists the governor to 2 or 3 other places, Lysanias. Why does he do that? because he's locating us in a particular historical moment. And that is part of the way the Bible works. It works in real space-time history. That's very different from, say, the Hindu Upanishads, which are the sacred scriptures of Hindus. The Upanishads are not located in history. They are just abstractions. But Christian thought is located in real space-time history. That means there is an objective side to the Christian faith. And that can be actually investigated. Do I think Caesar Augustus was the Caesar when Jesus was born? I can actually demonstrate that beyond reasonable doubt. Okay? So there is a relationship between faith and reason. They aren't the same thing, but they do have a relationship with each other. Here's another kind of question. On the other hand, can someone be reasoned into the Christian faith? What do you think? Steve says yes. I guess. You guys thumb up.
Not alone.
I don't think alone. I think you can help people remove intellectual roadblocks to their faith, but to close the deal, so to speak, has to be something God does, not something I can do just on an intellectual basis. But reason does play a role. It isn't somehow at odds with the gospel, but on the other hand, the Holy Spirit works beyond just that as well. Vicki.
I remember when we took our SDS students to the British Museum.
Yeah.
I found one of the guys almost in tears, just looking at these stone
Artifacts. Yeah.
And he had seen a date on this artifact that was the same as the date in the Bible, and it, like the whole thing had just become revelation.
Yeah.
That it's real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is real space-time history. There's a prism at the British Museum called the Taylor Prism, which has a rather famous name from the Bible in it, Hezekiah. Sennacherib invaded Jerusalem, and he shut Hezekiah up in the city of Jerusalem, and you can read about it in the book of Isaiah, and you can read about it in the book of 2 Kings, and you can read about it on the prism of Sennacherib. The very, very same story. And the fact that the one is a historical document totally outside the Bible that says the same thing as the Bible itself says is part of this intersection between history and faith, between reason and faith. And so faith is not reason, but faith and reason are not alienated from each other in the Christian faith. You do not have to check your brains at the door when you come to be a Christian. Now, that may not be a great thing for you, but it's a great thing for me. I grew up in a church that kind of thought you did have to check your brains at the door. You know, they had a basket. Brains, put your brain in here. You're not going to need this anymore. You're a Christian now. And I'm glad to tell you that I got out of that mess. And I think it was a mess. I think it was incorrect. And it impoverished my faith rather than help my faith. Any other thoughts on that? I'll tell you a story about my philosophy professor, David Crawford. When I went to the University of Detroit, I was one of the very few Christians in the philosophy department. They didn't attract a lot of Christians. And the head of my department was Dr. David Crawford, who was from Yale University and was a specialist in existentialism and phenomenology, which is the area where I did my philosophy degree. So Dr. Crawford knew I was a Christian, and he himself was an agnostic at best, maybe an atheist, but at least agnostic. So we had a lot of interesting conversations, and he used to ask me to come to his office periodically, and we'd just sit and chat. And I remember when I was doing my master's thesis, I had to defend my thesis before 5 professors, of which Dr. Crawford was one. And so I'm defending my thesis orally, and Dr. Crawford, kind of funny looking guy, he's in there. Now, Dan, he said, Dan, let's just suppose that you discovered that Jesus was kind of like Socrates, you know. He might not have really been there. He's just a figment of Plato's imagination. And what if you discovered that Jesus was like that? What would you do? I thought, what's that got to do with my thesis? That's a different, I'm not even writing about that. But it was sort of symbolized this issue that he assumed that a real Christian really didn't need reason and could set it aside, and probably did set it aside. And so we get in this conversation, that's really not possible because Jesus exists. Well, how do you know that? Well, Dr. Crawford, you yourself ought to know that Jesus is talked about by Roman writers. He's talked about by not only biblical writers, but secular writers in the first century, no less. It's not like he's a magical figure. He's a real figure, back there. So we would go back and forth on this all the time. And I left the university and thought, well, I'll probably never hear anything about Dr. Crawford again. But about 3 years after I was out of the system, I have a mutual friend who was connected with the university, and he said, you'll never guess what happened. Dr. Crawford gave his heart to Christ. And about a year after that, Dr. Crawford died. Now, I don't know whether my conversation had anything at all to do with it, and I'm not suggesting necessarily they did, although I kind of privately hope they did. But the point is that even with someone who is steeped in a viewpoint that is alien from Christianity, there is a role to be played between reason and faith. And Dr. Crawford actually found that intersection himself and became a believer out of that concept, which is a really great thing. The Christian has reason to believe. It's not overwhelming. It's not like you can't help but believe. If I could make it so that you couldn't help but believe, I would be the greatest evangelist the world has ever seen. So it's not that kind of evidence, but it is reasonable evidence. Evidences, they're sufficient. They're not overwhelming, but they're definitely sufficient. And the Christian has reason to believe. So let me go to the great theologian Charles Schulz and his cartoon Peanuts. Everybody knows Peanuts, right? Yeah. This is the most famous cartoon strip in the world and has been translated into more languages than any other cartoon. You can read Peanuts in French, you can read it in German, you can read it in Swahili, you can read Peanuts almost anywhere. So here's Charlie Brown, he's on the mound. Now some of you who are from different countries that don't know American baseball, this may have a problem, I don't know. But anyway, he's on the mound. Lucy comes up, wait. Brush this guy back, Charlie Brown, give him the old beanball. Now, if you're not familiar with baseball, a beanball is where the pitcher throws the ball at the batter's head. That usually makes him nervous, even though he ducks it and doesn't get hit. When he gets up to bat again the next time, he's not real confident because he just basically dodged a 100-mile-an-hour missile. So she says, give him the old beanball, Charlie Brown, brush him back. Charlie Brown says, I can't do that. It wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be right. Listen to who's gone moral on us all of a sudden. Old wishy-washy here, he's too moral to throw a beanball. Well, what about the way the early settlers treated the Indians? Was that moral? How about the Children's Crusade? Was that moral? Yeah, and how about those awful ads you see nowadays? You call those moral, Charlie Brown? Do you think that incident at Harper's Ferry was consistent with morality? Well, define morality. Well, our whole system of freeways is a perfect example of what I'm trying to say. Have you listened to the radio lately? How about the whole conservation issue? Charlie Brown says, well, we never win any ball games, but we have some pretty interesting discussions. Now, the point of the cartoon, of course, is that people think about things even if they don't articulate them. And we as human beings have these moral motions, pro or con. It's, as we said earlier, kind of hardwired within us. So We have these kind of ideas of justice. We spend a lot of time talking about justice. Even atheists talk about justice. Don't they? Absolutely they do. They want justice. But what is justice? And there's all kinds of definitions. Is it punitive equality? This is the old eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You know, you knock out my eye, I get to knock out your eye. That's punitive equality. Okay? Is it paying debts? Is that justice? Is it the greatest benefit for the most? In other words, if I can actually help society, even if that is a disadvantage to me personally, is that justice? What about enlightened self-interest? That whatever I do that's good for me is going to be good for everybody. Or survival of the fittest. That's a type of justice. Pretty much the one that comes out of evolution. Obedience to the law, is that justice? Do you all obey the law? Do you think that's important to obey the law? I have a friend who's a Lutheran pastor in San Diego that regularly drives about 95 miles an hour, and that's not an exaggeration, that he does. Every time I'm with him, and I occasionally preach in his church, I say, Roger, don't you have a problem with this? No, this is no problem. Boom, off we go. You know, I said, man, a roller coaster seems really tame compared to your driving. I mean, it's wild, you know. Obeying the law, right to privacy, is that justice? Is forgiveness justice? Well, where is justice? What is justice? Where do we get this idea of justice? Even though there's a lot of definitions, we are hardwired with some of these basic things that we think are right. And you don't have to be very old to know this. A 2-year-old has an idea that approximates justice. You take their toy and they have already learned one English word, mine. Mine, that's mine. In fact, they tend to apply it to just about everything they can get a hold of. Mine. But they have this idea that there's rights, there's certain things as justice. Here's another cartoon by Watterson. This is Calvin and Hobbes. Anybody know this cartoon? Yeah. And you know that Calvin is named after John Calvin, and Hobbes is named after the philosopher Thomas Hobbes? You don't know that? Okay, now you do. Okay? Calvin and Hobbes. So how you doing with your New Year's resolutions? Well, I didn't make any. See, in order to improve oneself, one must have some idea of what's good. And that implies certain values. But as we all know, values are relative. Every system of belief is equally valid, and we need to tolerate diversity. Virtue isn't better than vice, it's just different. Oh, I don't know if I can tolerate that much tolerance. I refuse to be victimized by notions of virtuous behavior. Does that pretty much describe the way a lot of people think about things? Yeah? So the human concept of morality makes sense in a world that's created by a holy God. If we have these moral motions, this sense of justice, where do we get this from? We don't think of animals as having this. I mean, when a wolf in northern Canada brings down a moose, he doesn't then go sit on the hill and say, I wonder if that was right. He's too busy eating. But we have these moral motions, and where does this come from if not from a holy God? Ideas of justice, rights, ethics, the notion that some things are right while other things are wrong makes sense in light of an infinite personal God who made humans in his own image. This is part of our Christian worldview. We believe that we have these things because they are directly derived from the fact that we are made in the image of God. We talked about that passage yesterday. We are created in the image of God, and that's partly why we think these things. I've used the picture of Dr. King here because of his strong stand for justice, particularly social justice. So how socially perceptive is Watterson's cartoon when Calvin says virtue isn't better than vice, it's just different? Is that a pretty perceptive comment about modern society? I think it probably is. How about if the idea of the good is entirely subjective how do you go about establishing what is good and what is not? All you're going to do is establish what you like or you don't like. But if there's no big truth, if there's no meta truth, if there's no overarching truth, then we are reduced to just personal taste. And that's all that is real. And that is a very empty way of life. So, what about rights? What's the sort of rights that, even according to the global community? I mean, we have these instinctive ways of thinking, and I think they go back to the idea of God. So, I think that's a good place for me to start winding down for today. Let me see if you have any other questions at this point, and rather than take a break, I'll answer your questions and then I'm going to let you go. Is it against the law to let them go early? It's okay? You have a couple of announcements and they're each about 15 minutes long, right? All right, any last questions? This has been a pretty heavy day. I know, because this is not as much, maybe quite as much fun as some of the other things, but I think it is important. Yeah, Heidi.
Do you have any other examples of the irreducibly complex idea, like other than the eye?
Well, yeah, there are other kinds of systems. They're all biological systems. Even certain kinds of cells, which have certain functions within the cells, they won't actually work without all of those things together. My best suggestion is, if you really want to pursue that, you get a copy of Dr. Behe's work, Darwin's Black Box. That's the title. You can Google it. You can find it easily. And it's a bit scientific because he is, after all, a scientist. But it does take you to those, a variety of kinds of biological mechanisms that are all reducibly incomplex. I use the eye as one that everybody's more or less familiar with. But he goes into cellular structure and a variety of things like that that are real important. Yeah.
I think the library has that.
Oh, does it? Interesting. So the library here on the U of N campus may have it. Well, there you don't even have to buy it. You just have to go look for it. You know? All right. Yeah. Yes.
So you mentioned like the Hindu Bible, and I read a little parts and bits of it, and I was really surprised that there's a lot of stories that are similar to the Bible. So how would you explain the connection or the differences, like, yeah, who's the author?
Between like the Upanishads and the Vedas, are you talking about that? The Hindu Bible?
Yes.
Yeah, and the Christian Bible?
Yeah.
Well, the similarities are mostly going to be found not in the Upanishads and Vedas, but in the Bhagavad Gita. Because the Bhagavad Gita is a sort of the, more or less the equivalent of the New Testament, I guess you would say, in terms of Hinduism. And so it has a lot of principles in it that have to do with love, with compassion, and so on. But those are principles that I think are common to both the Bhagavad Gita and the Bible, because those are principles that are instinctive within humans. We have these motions for compassion. We feel compassion for people and for situations. That isn't just true of people who are Christians, that's true of people all over the world. And so I don't find it a problem that there are those similarities. What I don't think is that there is some sort of direct connection between them. There are thematic similarities, and you could say that in terms of probably a lot of religious things. I mean, there's certain parts of the Quran that are going to be compatible with parts of the Bible, but there's not that kind of direct crossover. It's more of indirect kind of thing. And I think that would be true of the Bhagavad Gita as well. Yeah, so that would be my thought at least. Yeah. Anyone else? Yep.
Kind of a strange question. How does, or maybe just any thoughts you have on it, like, how does the fact that we ourselves, for the most part, are Western educated and a product of all the very things that we're critiquing affect how we critique them and how we think about our faith? Like, even how we do apologetics is somewhat shaped by more of the Aristotle than Plato and so on. So
Yeah. Well, I think that's endemic to the fact that Christianity actually came up in the Greco-Roman world. It's only when you get into the Old Testament that you have something that is a little different than the Greco-Roman cultural model for intellectual life. So the Bible has a foot in both of those worlds. The Old Testament is in the Hebrew world, which is somewhat more Eastern, and then the New Testament has the other foot in the Greco-Roman world, which is somewhat more Western. And I think that's one reason we need both of the Testaments. We need both sides of that, culturally speaking, to bridge that gap. I do think that it can be difficult to present the New Testament strictly from a Western point of view to people who are not Western, because there's a lot of things that don't quite make sense to them. And so I think we need to broaden that out to include both the Old and the New Testaments, and that may be helpful. Sometimes what I find is that people who are not Western actually understand some things in the Gospels better than people who are Western, because some of the Gospels, the stories in the Gospels are set within the context of a more Eastern point of view. Take, for instance, the parable of the prodigal son. I mean, we hear the story of the prodigal son, we know he left home and so on. But reading that from an Easterner's point of view can be pretty enlightening, actually, where in an Eastern way of thinking in which family relationship is so very central to their culture, for a son to basically say to his father, "I wish you were dead," which is what the young son did, is so unthinkable in an Eastern culture. It's not that unthinkable in a Western culture. Kids do stupid things like that all the time. But in Eastern culture, they just don't do that. And this gives us a window into a way of thinking that I think is helpful. So it is a challenge, the fact that Christianity did largely come up through a Western channel. And some of that can be a challenge for how to make that then accessible to people who are not from that Western mindset. That's part of your task as missionaries, I guess. Yeah.
Genesis chapter 1 verse 28. Yes. Be plentiful and multiply the earth and his. Yes. What is the meaning?
Well, to be fruitful and multiply basically means to have kids. Okay? And so as humans and their offspring, they will actually govern the earth. They will be the highest intellectual creatures that God made, which will manage the earth. They'll manage crops, fields, society, all of those things. They will manage those. And that's pretty much the way it's happened. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Or am I missed your question?
Just and rain and
Oh, reign over them?
rain over them. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Govern
Govern, reign.
rain.
Okay, those are terms that we usually use of kings. Okay, in a small sense, humans are like kings in that they are intellectually over the rest of the creation. And so reign there is more of a metaphor. You know what I mean by metaphor? It's an idiom of speech. It's a figurative way of speaking. Nothing I've said makes sense, has it? Well, let's talk about it privately, because I think I'm not making much help for you, actually, and maybe I can explain it better, and I'll see you after class, okay? Let's do that, okay? Okay. I think we're about ready for you guys, okay?